Picture this. A camera phone is propped up on a stack of paperbacks in the back corner of a small town library. The room is so quiet you can hear the clock over the emergency exit, ticking away above the soft rustle of pages. A few adults sit at tables, heads bent over laptops and legal pads. It feels like any other Tuesday afternoon. And then, right between a row of travel guides and a shelf of gardening books, a tiny bobcat kitten eases her face through a gap in the books. Golden eyes half closed, ears pricked just a little too big for her head, mouth pulled up on one side in what looks, unmistakably, like a crooked little grin. The people at the table see her. One man's shoulders start to shake. A woman bites down on her knuckle, trying not to laugh out loud. Someone presses a hand over their mouth, eyes watering. What you hear on that clip is not a roar of laughter, not chaos, just those small, helpless sounds grown-ups make when something is funnier than they expected, and they're trying very hard to behave. On the screen, the caption reads, "Bobcat kitten who turned a quiet library into her comedy club. Try not to laugh." That clip will travel far beyond the town of Willow Creek, Colorado. It will show up in group chats and on big screens in break rooms, shared by people who say, "You need this today." But it starts in one real place, with one real librarian, and a building that has forgotten how to breathe. The library is Willow Creek Public, a low brick building tucked up against the foothills, a drive away from pine ridges and narrow creeks where bobcats actually live. Inside, everything has a kind of controlled stillness. The lights hum, computer screens glow. Signs remind visitors to return books on time, wash their hands, and use quiet voices. And moving through that careful silence is Nora Bennett. We're not going to spend long on what she looks like. What matters is the way she moves, the way her shoulders inch up just a little when a chair scrapes the floor, the way her jaw tightens when someone lets out a laugh that's a bit too sudden, the way her hand hovers near a small, "Please, quiet voices" sign at the front desk, as if touching it might steady her heartbeat. For Nora, quiet is not just a rule, it's a shield. Every sound in that building lands in her body, not just in her ears. The clock over her head, the cartwheels hit a metal strip. The printer started up in the middle of an otherwise empty hour. For a lot of us, those things fade into the background. For her, each one is another little jolt. So when you hear that title, a bobcat kitten turning a quiet library into her comedy club, it's not just a cute line. It's a reversal of everything Nora has been holding together for years. The first time Cedar, that's the bobcat kitten, peeks through the shelves, Nora isn't holding a phone. She's at the desk, checking in a stack of returns, trying to ignore the constant hum of the heater. She sees a group of adult patrons at the back table suddenly straighten, then lean in toward each other, faces lit with the kind of grin people usually save for backyard stories, not non-fiction aisles. Her first instinct is the same one she's had for a long time. Walk over, remind them that other people are trying to concentrate. Keep the lid on. But as she steps into the aisle, she sees what they see. A small spotted face between the books. A bobcat kitten, Cedar, resting her chin on the edge of a shelf. It's the most natural thing in the world. Not pacing, not threatening, just watching. Like the library is a show, and she has front row seats. The man at the table looks up at Nora with wide eyes, clearly waiting for the scolding. Instead, she hears herself whisper, "It's all right, just try to keep it gentle. She spooks easily." He nods. Someone lets out the tiniest snort of laughter, then clamps down on it. The tension in the room is strange and sweet at the same time. Everyone is trying not to laugh. Not out of fear of the librarian, but out of respect for a wild little visitor who doesn't understand what a quiet zone is. In that moment, the library hadn't suddenly become loud. It hasn't turned into a circus. The bobcat hasn't started performing tricks. But something subtle shifts. The silence in the room is no longer a lid. It's a shared agreement. Let's keep this softness. Let's not scare her away. If you've ever had a place in your life that felt too quiet, a home after someone moved out, a workplace after a layoff, a routine after retirement, You may recognize this feeling. The first time something genuinely funny happens in that space, something that you didn't plan and can't control, it can feel almost dangerous to let yourself enjoy it. Laughing means admitting the world is still moving. Cedar, in her own bobcat way, gives everyone in that room permission to feel both things at once: the comfort of quiet and the lift of shared humor. She doesn't know she's in a library. She doesn't know what viral video means. She only knows that this room is warm, the shelves are high, and the humans are watching her with a mix of awe and barely contained delight. From the outside, it looks like just another try not to laugh animal clip. When you sit with it a little longer, it becomes something else. A wild animal finding temporary refuge in a human space, and a human space remembering what it's like to be alive. In this story, we're going to stay with both of them. We'll stay with Cedar, the little bobcat kitten wandering a bit too far from the foothills. And we'll stay with Nora, whose whole nervous system is built around keeping this building calm, even when it means keeping herself a little numb. If you've ever turned down the volume on your own life just to feel safe, this might feel familiar. In the next part, we're going to step back from that first funny moment and quietly trace how Nora's fear of sound began, and why this particular bobcat's crooked little smile will matter more to her than any number on a view counter. For now, if you're watching along, you might just notice how your own shoulders feel as you listen, and maybe let them drop just a little as we follow this unlikely comedy club in the middle of a Colorado library. Before Cedar ever found that back room, before a bobcat kitten turned this quiet library into her comedy club, there was just Nora and the noise inside her own chest. If you had walked into Willow Creek Public on a weekday afternoon, you might not have noticed anything unusual. A few people at tables, the soft clack of keyboard keys, someone turning pages in the magazine corner. It would have looked peaceful from the outside, but if you stood close to the front desk, right next to Nora, you would have heard a different soundtrack. The clock above the door ticking a little too loudly. The heater kicked on with a low rumble that made the picture frames buzz. The cartwheels hit the metal strip between carpet and tile with a sharp, hollow clunk. Each of those sounds is small, harmless, every day. Inside Nora's body, they didn't feel small at all. When a teenager dragged a chair instead of lifting it, her shoulders jumped just slightly. When two old friends recognized each other near the new releases and greeted each other a little too warmly, you could see her hand pause above the barcode scanner, fingers tightening around a library card. None of this was about disliking people. Nora loved what a public library stood for. Free access, shared stories, a place where anyone in town could come in out of the cold without being asked why. But somewhere along the way, volume had turned into a threat. It goes back to one night. In Willow Creek, people still remember it as that history talk that went wrong. For Nora, it's just the night the world got loud, all at once. Her father, Thomas Bennett, was something of a local favorite. He volunteered at the library, led gentle workshops about old photographs and the town's mining past. He wasn't a performer. He was a quiet man who just loved standing in front of a map and explaining how the river had changed course over a century. That evening, the reading room was fuller than usual. Folks dragged in extra chairs. Someone set out a tray of cookies on the back table. There was an easy buzz in the air, the kind towns hear at high school games or potlucks. For a while, Nora enjoyed it. She watched her dad adjust the microphone, clear his throat, look out at faces he'd known for 20 years. And then, in the middle of a sentence about early settlers, his voice slipped. He reached for the podium with the wrong hand. The mic scraped against fabric. Someone laughed, thinking he'd made a joke, until they saw his face go slack. The sounds came fast after that. A chair crashed back as someone leapt to their feet. A woman shouted his name. Another voice yelled, "Call 911!" The mic hit the floor with a sharp, echoing pop that made people flinch. The buzz of conversation turned jagged and high. Somewhere far off, sirens started to wail their way toward the building. None of it was anyone's fault. It was just what happens when people get scared and try to help at the same time. But that knot of sounds wrapped itself around Nora's memory and never really let go. Her father didn't come back to the library after that night. Eventually, the staff put up a small framed photo of him by the local history shelves. Thomas Bennett, smiling in front of a map, a plain line underneath with his name and the dates. Most patrons pass it without noticing. Nora sees it every day. After the ambulance, after the hospital, after the paperwork and the casseroles and the quiet mornings that followed, Nora came back to work. The building looked the same. The tables were straightened, the chairs pushed in, the microphone coiled neatly in a drawer. The room, though, didn't sound the same. Every laugh felt a little too loud. Every sudden noise felt like the beginning of another emergency. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She tried to turn the volume down. She added one more "Please, quiet voices" sign near the entrance. She started walking the shelves a bit more often, gently reminding people to keep it down. She removed the small radio that used to play classical music at the front desk. The community book club, which had once met in the main room and spilled a little laughter over the edges, got moved to a side conference room with a door. Little by little, the soundscape narrowed. Patrons adjusted. Some stopped coming as often. Others simply lowered their tones, choosing their words like people in a waiting room. The library became a refuge for anyone who wanted to get away from ringing phones and loud TVs. From the outside, that might sound ideal. Inside, Nora wasn't resting. She was bracing. Every day she kept her nervous system on a quiet little leash, making sure nothing in the room got big enough to remind her of that night. Silence became less of a comfort and more of a job. If you're listening to this and remembering the first time a restaurant felt too loud after a loss, or when you found yourself turning down the radio because your thoughts were already noisy enough, you know this pattern. Pull life in. Close the door. Keep things small so nothing big can hurt you again. For Nora, Willow Creek Public started to mirror that state. The building itself took on the shape of her grief. The fluorescent lights, the careful signs, the long periods with no new programs on the bulletin board. A public space that was slowly forgetting it was a public space. That's what makes Cedar's arrival later so powerful. Because when a bobcat kitten walks into that kind of room, she doesn't know any of this history. She doesn't know about heart monitors or ambulance sirens or bad news delivered in hushed tones. She only knows the difference between threat and shelter, between chaos and calm. And somehow, she will show Nora that sound does not have to mean danger. Before we get to the scratch and clatter in the back room, to the moment when Cedar first curls up on a stack of boxes in the archive, it helps to hold this picture of Nora clearly. A woman doing her best to keep a whole building quiet so her own heart doesn't have to remember. In the next part, we'll walk that hallway with her and hear the first strange noise that doesn't fit her careful rules. We'll open the storage door together and see what she sees. Not a threat, not a memory, but a small wild body that has chosen the library as a place to rest. As you listen on, you might gently notice how sound moves through your own life, and maybe allow a little room for the possibility that some new noises, like the soft footsteps of a bobcat in the stacks, could mean something different than they used to. The day it happened didn't look special at all. It was a Tuesday, the kind of Colorado morning where the sky over Willow Creek is the same pale gray as the concrete in the parking lot. Inside the library, everything sounded exactly like Nora preferred it. The steady tick of the clock, the low hum of the vents, the quiet shuffle of one man in the newspaper corner folding pages back with care. Then, under all of that, something else. A quick, soft rattle, like a box nudged from the inside. Nora froze with a stack of returned books in her hands. She lifted her head, listening. Nothing. Just the familiar sounds she'd trained herself to accept. She exhaled, shelved one title in the new nonfiction section, and tried to let it go. A minute later, it came again. This time, it was clearer. A scrape, a hollow thump, then a faint, skittering sound from the back of the building. Not loud, not dramatic, but out of place in the orderly rhythm of Willow Creek Public. Nora set the rest of the books down, covers thudding softly against the desk. Her mind did what minds do, ran through the list of possibilities. Old pipes, loose ductwork, maybe a mouse in the archive room. She didn't love any of those options, but she could live with them. What she couldn't live with was not knowing. Uncertainty had always been louder inside her than any actual noise. So she stepped out from behind the desk and started down the hallway that led to the staff offices and storage rooms. The carpet muffled her footsteps. As she walked, the hum of the main room faded behind her, replaced by the harsher buzz of old fluorescent lights. The air felt different back there, cooler, carrying the dry smell of paper and cardboard. She paused outside the door marked Archive and Storage, hand on the knob. For a split second, her body flashed back to another door, another night, people rushing and shouting. She closed her eyes, took one slow breath, and reminded herself, this is not that. This is today. Just a sound that needs an answer. She turned the knob and eased the door open. At first, all she saw were boxes, towers of donated books, plastic bins of holiday decorations, rows of old newspapers bound with twine. Dust motes drifted in the sharp overhead light. Then, in the far corner, the stack of flattened cardboard moved. Nora squinted, staying in the doorway, every sense on alert. The cardboard dipped and rose again, very slightly. A shape was curled there, so well tucked into itself that her brain refused to make sense of it at first. And then it did. A small body, fur mottled with tawny and gray, with darker spots along the back and legs. Ears with tiny black tufts, a short, bobbed tail lying still as a question mark. A bobcat kitten. Cedar. At that moment, Cedar wasn't a viral video or a funny clip. She was just a wild little animal who had somehow ended up in the back room of a quiet library, huddled on a makeshift bed of cardboard, watching Nora with wide, gold eyes. Nora's heart pounded so loud it drowned out the buzzing light. Everything in her wanted to slam the door, run, make it someone else's problem. Another part of her, the part that had spent years nurturing this building and everyone who walked into it, couldn't look away from how small Cedar seemed, how tired. Cedar didn't growl or lunge. She didn't do anything a cartoon bobcat might do. She just watched. Her sides rose and fell in fast, shallow breaths. Her paws were tucked under her chest, claws hidden. The only tension in her body was the kind you see in any creature that's not sure if it's safe yet. Very slowly, Nora pulled her phone out of her pocket. Not to film, to call for help. She found the number for the nearest wildlife rescue center on a faded brochure the library kept near the staff bulletin board, the kind of pamphlet people walk past without reading. As the phone rang, she kept her eyes on Cedar, holding her own breath like she might startle the kitten if she breathed too loudly. A calm voice answered on the other end. Nora's words came out in a careful whisper. This is the Willow Creek Public Library. I think I have a bobcat kitten in my storage room. There was a pause. Not disbelief, just surprise. Then the questions came, low and methodical. Is she moving? Is she bleeding? Is there an obvious injury? Nora answered as best she could. No obvious wounds. Yes, she's awake. No, she's not acting aggressively, just scared. And so am I. The rescuer explained gently that bobcats sometimes follow creek beds or green belts down into town, especially younger ones who've strayed from their mothers. Buildings that stay quiet, like warehouses, or a barely used library storage room, can feel like shelters. They told her what to do. Keep the area calm. Don't try to get closer. Close other doors so the kitten doesn't end up in the parking lot or on the main street. Someone would come, but it might take a while. They had other animals on the schedule that day. So Nora did something that went against every instinct she'd built since her father's collapse. She let an unknown sound stay for a little while without shutting it down. She backed away from the doorway, heart still racing, and started quietly adjusting the building around this new presence. She put a "staff only beyond this point today" sign at the start of the hallway. She gently redirected the man from the newspaper corner when he wandered too far back, offering him a fresh magazine as a distraction. She asked the one person working at a table to please stick to the front half of the room. Just for today. In the middle of all that, she kept thinking, a wild animal chose this building, chose this silence, chose us. Something is humbling about that thought. For years, Nora had been trying to keep the library so controlled, so carefully quiet, that nothing unexpected could happen inside those walls. And yet, here was the most unexpected visitor of all. A bobcat kitten, Cedar, trusts the library's stillness enough to sleep in it. If you've ever had your life disrupted, not by something loud and obvious, but by a small, strange sign you couldn't ignore, a new ache, an odd phone call, a knock at the door, you might recognize this feeling. The sense that the story is about to change, and the change is arriving on soft feet. In the next part of this story, we'll see how Cedar moves from that back room into the heart of the building, how a bobcat kitten starts slipping between shelves and, without meaning to, turns a cautious library into her quiet comedy club. As you listen, you might notice what you usually do with strange sounds in your own life, and whether there's room, just a little, to stay curious before you close the door. When the rescue center said, "It may take us a while to get there," Nora hung up the phone and realized something simple and unsettling. For at least the next few hours, a bobcat kitten was her responsibility. Not just an image on a pamphlet, not a story on the local news. A real, breathing, trembling little bobcat in a room that was never meant to hold anything wilder than old newspapers. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, hand still on the archive door, listening to Cedar's breathing on the other side. It was fast and light, almost like the sound of pages being flipped in a hurry. Nora knew two things. One, she couldn't just leave Cedar there, surrounded by teetering boxes and metal shelves. Two, she couldn't risk this skittish bobcat bolting through the building the moment someone else opened the wrong door. So she did what librarians do best. She rearranged space. First, she chose the local history reading room. It was small, with tall windows and a solid door she could keep cracked open. There were low shelves, sturdy chairs, and no direct route to the front entrance. It had always been her father's favorite room, the place he used to set up maps and old photographs. Today, it would become a temporary sanctuary. Nora rolled a couple of book carts into the doorway of the archive, making a soft corridor that led toward the reading room. She spoke in a low voice as she worked, not because Cedar understood the words, but because tone matters to any nervous creature, human or wild. "You're all right," she murmured. "We're going to find you somewhere better than this." With the hallway cleared and doors along the way closed, she eased the archive door open again. Cedar was still on the flattened cardboard, eyes now more alert than afraid. When Nora stepped into the room, the bobcat kitten's muscles tensed. She didn't snarl. She didn't charge. She simply gathered herself like something ready to run if it had to. Nora stayed near the door and gave Cedar options. A path out, but not toward chaos. There's a difference between trapping an animal and guiding it. It took time. Little shifts. Cedar lifts her head. A cautious step toward the light. A pause. Nose testing the air that smelled less like dust and more like people and coffee and printer ink. Finally, Cedar slipped off the cardboard, padded across the concrete floor, and moved down the makeshift corridor, away from the deepest, loudest noises of the building, into Nora's father's old room. Inside the reading room, Nora had already pulled chairs against the walls, set a low table as a buffer near the window, and left the highest shelf completely clear. She watched as Cedar did what bobcats do. She didn't choose the cozy rug or the chair or the corner by the heater. She leapt up to that empty shelf with an ease that made Nora's heart stutter, then settled there, pressed against the wall, every exit in view. The terrified guest had found her perch. Over the next day, Nora built a careful rhythm around Cedar. She put up a handwritten sign on the reading room door. Quiet zone. Wildlife in recovery. Please respect our guests. She brought bowls of water, set them down, and stepped back, letting Cedar decide when to move. She coordinated with the rescue staff so they could check Cedar without turning each visit into a spectacle. She also had to deal with people, not children. We'll stay with adults in this version of the story, but the kind of grown-ups who still get wide-eyed when they hear the words bobcat kitten. A grad student who spent long afternoons studying at the same table. A retiree who came in most mornings to read Western novels. A paramedic who liked the quiet after long shifts on the road. They noticed the new sign. They noticed Nora's body language, her firm, calm presence by that door. They noticed glimpses of mottled fur in the window when Cedar shifted positions on her shelf. One afternoon when the rescue team was running late, Nora allowed 3 regulars to sit in the reading room under strict conditions. No phones out, no sudden movements, no approaching the shelf. They agreed, almost solemn, like they were entering a chapel. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Cedar lay perfectly still on the high shelf, paws tucked, eyes slitted, looking for all the world like a carved wooden ornament someone had forgotten to dust. The room settled into an unusual kind of quiet. Not the stiff, enforced hush Nora was used to, but a held breath, shared by everyone. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed softer here. Then Cedar moved. She stood, stretched in that long, rippling way cats do, and suddenly hopped from shelf to shelf, finding a small gap between 2 rows of hardcovers. The 3 patrons' heads turned in sync, watching. On the other side of the wall, another shelf backed up to the same spot. A window of space between regional field guides and Natural History of the Rockies. That's where Cedar's face appeared, just like in the clip. Eyes half closed, whiskers forward, mouth lifting at one corner as she tested the air with that funny little flamin' grimace that humans always mistake for a smirk. Her nose wrinkled, and for a second, she looked exactly like she'd heard the best joke and wasn't going to repeat it. The paramedic at the table made an involuntary noise, half gasp, half laugh, and slapped his hand over his mouth. The retiree's shoulders shook. The grad student pressed her fingers against her lips, tears in her eyes from the effort of staying quiet. In any other week, Nora would have stepped in. She would have reminded them they were in a library, that other people were working, that this was not a zoo. Instead, she stood in the doorway and felt something shift inside her chest. The sound in that room was not the sharp, chaotic noise of panic she associated with her father's collapse. It was softer. It was laughter wrapped in care. People doing everything they could to contain their reactions so they wouldn't scare a small, wild animal. For the first time in a long time, sound didn't feel like a threat. It felt like life. And Cedar, without meaning to, had just turned a sterile reading room into a quiet comedy club. From then on, her routines became part of the library's rhythm. Cedar would slip between shelves, appear in odd places, test objects with her paws, always gravitating toward high, overlooked spots. Patrons began to time their visits, hoping to catch one of those moments. They'd share knowing smiles when they did, the way people do when they've witnessed something they can't quite explain. If you've ever had a guest in your life who arrived frightened and slowly turned into the one who made you laugh the hardest, a parent moving in, a friend staying after a loss, you know how surprising that transformation can be. In our next part, we'll see how one of those quiet, almost private moments with Cedar makes its way onto a phone screen, out into the world, and how the internet learns about the bobcat kitten who made a library her stage. For now, you might just notice the small, accidental comedians in your own life. The ones who never asked to be center stage, but somehow make the room feel warmer just by being exactly who they are. By the time Cedar's story reached the internet, all it really was a quiet moment in a quiet room. It started on an ordinary afternoon with a stack of textbooks, a half-finished cup of coffee, and a grad student named Daniel trying to stay awake through his notes. He'd become one of Cedar's regulars, timing his study sessions for the hours when the bobcat kitten was most likely to be awake. On this day, before he opened his laptop, he walked up to the front desk, holding his phone in both hands. "Would it be all right," he asked Nora, "if I just set this on the table? Camera facing the shelves. No flash, no movement. Nobody believes me when I tell them a bobcat kitten stares at me while I'm reading." The old Nora would have said no before he finished the sentence. The building had seen enough drama. No cameras, no distractions, no reasons for things to get out of control. But the new reality included a wild guest, a rescue center, and a room full of people who had been quietly changed by this bobcat's presence. Nora had already sat with the staff from the wildlife rescue talking about boundaries. If any filming happened, it needed to be low-key, respectful. No crowds pressing against the glass. No one is trying to coax Cedar into tricks. So she surprised herself. "As long as it stays on the table," she said. "No flash, and you don't move toward her. If she looks unsettled, it stops. Deal?" He nodded immediately, the way someone does when they understand they've been trusted with something fragile. He set the phone flat near his notebook, camera pointed over his shoulder at the shelves. On screen, the frame was simple. Rows of books, the corner of a table, a slice of window. The kind of image most people scroll past without really seeing. Then Cedar did what Cedar always does. At first, she was just a shadow, up high in the reading room, pacing along a shelf, testing edges with her paws. It took her a while to find her moment. The building was quiet. The three people in the room were absorbed in their reading, shoulders soft, pen tapping lightly against paper. And then, between two hardcovers on the far shelf, that familiar face appeared. A bobcat kitten, golden eyes squinting against the light, whiskers forward, mouth curved up in that crooked half grin as she sniffed the air. She held the pose for a heartbeat. Then, as if satisfied, she withdrew, only to pop up a few minutes later 2 feet to the left. Over the next half hour, Cedar turned the back of that room into a tiny stage, slipping between Rocky Mountain wildflowers and beginner's birding, peeking through narrow gaps and disappearing again. There was no soundtrack, no dramatic zoom. Just the rustle of pages, a soft throat clearing, the almost silent huff of someone swallowing a laugh. Later, at home, Daniel watched the footage on a bigger screen. He trimmed out the long stretches of nothing. He kept quiet. He added a single line of text at the top. "Bobcat kitten turns our small-town library into her comedy club. Try not to laugh." Quietly. No hashtags, no shouting in all caps, just that. He sent it to a friend in a nearby city, who sent it to a cousin, who posted it in a group for wildlife enthusiasts. From there, it slipped into the current. Soon the comments started. Not the cruel kind, not the ones that people dread. These were gentle, curious lines that sounded a lot like the patrons in the reading room. "Is she safe? Is she okay? Please tell me there's a rescue center involved. I didn't know bobcats lived anywhere near town." This made my whole day better. A local outdoors group shared the clip with a note about living alongside wild neighbors. A librarian in another state shared it with staff, saying, "Imagine this at our reference desk." A wildlife rehab organization reposted it, adding a short explanation about bobcats in Colorado and how to help them by protecting green spaces. Back at Willow Creek, Nora discovered the video the way so many of us discover things now, on someone else's phone. She was shelving returns when the paramedic who often read in the afternoons walked up, holding out his screen. "This is here," he said. "Right? That's the history room." On the tiny display, she watched Cedar's face appear between the books, that same crooked, not quite smile lighting up the gap. She saw the dim outline of the table where she'd stood so many times, trying to keep everything under control. She heard the faint sound of someone stifling a chuckle. Her first reaction wasn't pride or panic. It was something quieter, the strange feeling of seeing a place you know intimately from someone else's point of view. The wildlife rescue called that same day. The clip had reached them too. They were calm but clear. This was exactly the kind of attention they'd been preparing for. Together, they put a plan in place. A small sign at the front desk explained that Cedar was a temporary wildlife rescue guest, supervised by professionals. Another sign at the reading room door spelled out what it meant to share space with a bobcat. No flash, limited visitors at a time, no knocking or tapping or calling her name. When a local news station asked if they could film the bobcat librarian, the rescue staff gently redirected the narrative. On air, they spoke about Sita not as a mascot, but as a symbol of how wild animals sometimes slip into human spaces when their own habitats are stressed. The segment used a few seconds of the original clip, paired with a longer, steadier shot of Sita, simply resting on her shelf, eyes half closed, clearly not performing for anyone. For Nora, the oddest moment came later that week. Standing in her own kitchen, watching her own library on the evening news, she saw the same walls, the same windows, the same "Quiet Please" sign she had straightened 100 times. But she also saw the building through the eyes of people far away. People who would never sit under Sita's shelf, who would never feel the subtle change in the room when a bobcat kitten woke up and stretched. It raised an unexpected question. What does it mean for a place that has been a refuge from the world to suddenly be seen by the world? The internet attention brought warmth, but it also brought weight. Donations found their way to the rescue center. A few more people came through the library doors just to see. And with each new face, Nora had to balance something she'd never had to balance before: the quiet need of a wild animal and the very human urge to be close to something rare. If you've watched viral animal clips and felt that mix of joy and worry, delight at the moment, concern about the story behind it, you know the tension here. Cedar's Comedy Club couldn't become a circus. It had to stay a place where the bobcat's needs came first, even if that meant letting some moments stay off camera. In the next part, we'll look at how Willow Creek Public itself began to change as Cedar stayed a little longer. How the building, the people, and even the sound of the room slowly shifted from a fixed hush to a living, breathing quiet. As you continue, you might think about the last time something small from your own life went out there into the wider world, and how different it felt to see your own ordinary place reflected through someone else's screen. If you had walked into Willow Creek Public a few months before Cedar arrived, you might have wondered if anyone had turned the volume of life down just a bit too far. But as weeks passed with a bobcat kitten sleeping on a shelf and peeking through the stacks, something subtle began to happen. The library itself started to sound different. The first change was almost invisible. It showed up in the little choices Nora made when she opened the doors each morning. Instead of flipping on every fluorescent light at once, she started leaving a few of them off near the windows, letting the Colorado sun do some of the work. The harsh buzz softened. The room felt less like a waiting room, more like a place where people actually lived. She moved a small display table near the entrance too, where there had once been only policy notices and overdue slip reminders. There were now field guides to local wildlife, a book on bobcats of the Rockies, and a couple of nature memoirs with worn spines. A handwritten sign read, "Sharing space with our wild neighbors." At first, only a few people stopped to look. A retired teacher ran her fingers over a map of migration routes. A man in work boots checked out a guide to animal tracks, admitting he'd always wondered about the paw prints near his shed. The building was still quiet, but the quiet had started to include curiosity. Inside the reading room, Cedar kept doing what Cedar does best, being a bobcat. She claimed her favorite routes, from the high shelf near the window, across a beam of light, to a narrow ledge above the doorway. She listened for every door opening, every footstep in the hall. When the heater kicked on with its low rumble, her ears twitched, and she adjusted her position just enough to see both exits. Nora began to notice her own body responding differently to those same sounds. The heater's rumble, once just another item in a long list of irritations, became a cue. Check on Cedar. The click of the reading room door no longer signaled potential disruption. It meant another regular had arrived. Someone who knew how to sit under a bobcat's perch without trying to own the moment. And the people who came, grown-ups with their own tiredness and grief and need for quiet, started to change too. There was the grad student, still peeling off her noise-canceling headphones, one ear at a time. In the beginning, she wore them like a shield, shutting out everything but the scratch of her own pen. After a few weeks of studying under Cedar's shelf, she began leaving them around her neck. She told Nora almost shyly, "It's strange, but I like hearing the pages turn. It makes me feel less alone." There was Mrs. Ramirez, who had bristled at the idea of a wild animal in a place of learning. She'd complained, gently but firmly, that libraries should be orderly, predictable, safe. Yet she kept showing up, always choosing the same chair where she could see Cedar's reflection in the window, knitting needles clicking in a quiet rhythm. One afternoon, Cedar stretched, yawned, and gave that crooked half-smile right above her head. Mrs. Ramirez's hands stopped mid-stitch. For a moment, her usually stern face softened into something almost childlike. She caught Nora's eye and whispered, "She thinks she runs this place." And then there was the ER nurse. He came in after long nights on the highway and in hospital corridors that never slept. At first, he sat near the door, ready to leave at the slightest sign of commotion. Over time, he migrated to a spot almost directly below Cedar's favorite shelf. He'd lean back in his chair, close his eyes for a minute, and just listen. To the clock, to the bobcat's slow movements above him, to the murmur of voices that no longer made him flinch. "I hear enough alarms out there," he told Nora one day. "In here, it's like my brain gets to exhale." What Nora noticed most was the tone of the sound now filling her building. It wasn't that the library had become loud. Phones still stayed on silent. Conversations still hovered at a low murmur. But the silence no longer had that brittle edge. When someone laughed, the sound rose and fell gently, like a wave that knew its limits. When a book fell from a cart, the sharp noise made people look up. But instead of Nora rushing in to apologize or scold, there was often a shared glance towards Cedar. If the bobcat remained calm, so did everyone else. The library was slowly learning to tell the difference between noise that wounds and sound that heals. You can see it in before and after glimpses. Before, static shots of empty tables, rigid rows of chairs, quiet please signs that felt more like warnings than invitations. After, small clusters of people under warmer light, a potted plant by the window, a bulletin board with flyers for Wild Neighbor Hour, and a community hike along the creek where bobcats actually roam. Signs that read, "Help us keep this a peaceful place for people and for Cedar." It wasn't perfect. Some days the room felt too full. On a few afternoons, Cedar got overstimulated by the constant shifting of bodies and the subtle buzz of attention. Her tail would twitch faster. Her ears would flatten just a bit. On those days, Nora and the rescue staff cut visits short, closed the door for a while, and let the bobcat kitten rest in real silence. Those choices taught the community something important. This wasn't about turning the library into a show. It was about sharing space with a wild heart and letting that experience change how they treated each other. Nora, perhaps more than anyone, felt the shift. She still noticed every sound. That part of her nervous system was not going to disappear. But where she once felt like she was fighting the room all day, pushing the volume down, tamping it back, she now felt more like she was conducting something gentle. A nod here to ask for softer voices, a smile there when a small ripple of laughter rose and then fell on its own without her needing to intervene. The quiet had become something people chose together, not something she enforced alone. If you've ever lived through a time when your home, your workplace, or even your own mind felt too tense to risk laughter, you might recognize this slow unwinding. It doesn't happen with a big speech. It happens in small moments. A shared smile, a softened voice, a wild animal exhaling on a shelf. In the next part, we'll step more fully into those wild neighbor hours and the gentle rules that kept Cedar a bobcat instead of turning her into a mascot. How boundaries, of all things, made the connection between people, library, and wild nature even deeper. As you listen on, you might take a breath and notice the sound around you right now, and ask yourself, which noises are hurting and which are quietly reminding you that you're still here, still part of a living, breathing world. The funny thing about Cedar's comedy club is that the closer people felt to her, the more important it became to remember she was not, and never would be, a house cat. She was a bobcat. And that meant love had to look a little different. It started with questions. The more that little video of Cedar peeking through the shelves made its way around the internet, the more people walked into Willow Creek Public with the same hopeful look in their eyes.
Can we pet her? Does she sit in laps? Could I get a selfie just real quick?
Nora heard it at the front desk. The wildlife rescue staff heard it on the phone. And underneath all those questions, there was something honest. A human heart wanting to be close to something wild and not quite knowing how to do that without putting hands on it. So together, the library and the rescue center shaped something new. Wild Neighbor Hour. It wasn't a show. There were no tickets, no stage, no spotlight. Just one small reading room, a handful of chairs arranged in a loose semicircle, and Cedar in her chosen place, high on a stable shelf where she could see every person in the room. The rules were simple, written in clear letters on a sign by the door. No touching, no flash, no calling her name. Keep voices low for her sake. People read it, nodded, and stepped inside, like they were crossing a threshold into a quieter kind of classroom. In those hours, you could feel how much Cedar was still a wild animal. While Nora read from books about bobcats and other wildlife of the Rockies, Cedar didn't sit politely and pose. She shifted when the air vent turned on. She flicked an ear toward the muffled slam of the outer doors. Once in a while, she hopped to a higher ledge, testing the strength of it with her paws before settling down again. A wildlife educator from the rescue center would sit off to the side, watching her body language like a second language. When Cedar's whiskers flared and her pupils widened at a distant noise, the educator quietly explained, "She hears more than we do. Even in here, she's doing what a bobcat does outside, tracking who's coming, who's going, what could be a threat." When Cedar shifted her weight and stretched one back leg, showing the powerful muscles under that spotted fur, they would talk about how much space a bobcat needs to roam, how many miles of creek and brush and rock ledge it takes for one wildcat to really live as itself. These were small things, but for the people sitting in that circle, people who'd grown used to bobcats as mascots on sports jerseys or quick glimpses in trail camera photos, they became a different sort of lesson. This wasn't a pet who happened to look exotic. This was a neighbor from the foothills passing through. Of course, not everyone found that line easy. One afternoon, a man who had driven in from 2 towns over sat through the whole hour with his hands gripped tight on his knees. At the end, as people shuffled out, he lingered near the door. "It just seems cruel," he said, voice low but firm. "She likes it here. You can tell."
Why not let her stay? She's safe, fed, loved.
Nora felt the sting of that. Part of her wanted the same thing. Cedar had become woven into the daily rhythm of the library, into her own healing. The idea of those shelves without a bobcat napping above them made her chest ache. The educator answered first. "Comfort isn't the only measure," she said gently. "For a bobcat, success isn't about being famous or adored. It's about having room to move like a bobcat, choose her own shelter, hunt in her own way, or, if she can't be released, living in a space built for her needs, not ours." She let that settle, then added, "Our job is to listen to what she needs now and later, even if those needs don't match what makes us feel better." Nora watched the man's expression change, the fight in his eyes softening into something closer to understanding. It was a quiet moment, but an important one. A human heart loosening its grip just a bit on the idea that love always means keeping. There were other days when Cedar herself made the boundaries clear. Now and then, during a wild neighbor hour, too many bodies in the room, or one dropped water bottle, would tip her from watchful to overwhelmed. You could see it in the quick twitch of her tail, in the way her ears angled back just slightly, in how she stopped that relaxed, smiling grimace and closed her mouth tight. On those days, Nora or the educator would simply stand and say, "She's telling us she's had enough today. We're going to give her the room back now." Nobody booed, nobody argued. People stood up, gathered their things, and filed out with a kind of tender awkwardness, like leaving a friend to rest after a long visit. And in that, there was another lesson. that we can care deeply about a wild animal and still step back when it needs space. The boundaries are not barriers to connection, but the very thing that makes real connection possible. Slowly, the library began to carry those wild lessons beyond Cedar's room. "Quiet, please" signs shifted into phrases like, "Help us keep this space peaceful, for people and for the wild neighbors who teach us." A bulletin board near the entrance is filled with flyers about creek cleanups, wildlife crossings, and how to keep pets indoors at night so bobcats like Cedar have safer paths through town. Nora found herself talking with patrons not only about due dates and holds, but about the sound of owls over their backyards, tracks they'd seen in fresh snow, small changes they could make so the world outside the library stayed hospitable to more than humans. And in the quiet of her own thoughts, another question kept returning. What happens next for Cedar? The rescue center had been honest from the beginning. As Cedar grew, they would assess her for release or for life at a sanctuary designed for wildcats. Larger spaces than any library could offer, more complex habitats, more room to be what she was born to be. For Nora, who had finally learned to live with sound again in the presence of this bobcat kitten, the thought of that future was both right and deeply sad. If you've ever loved something or someone you knew you couldn't keep, a grown child moving out, a friend relocating, a parent returning home after a stay, you may know this ache. It's a tension between gratitude for what's been shared and the quiet grief of letting the season change. In our final part, we'll walk with Nora through that transition. The last regular days of Cedar's Comedy Club. The first, and the way the library and everyone inside it carries the imprint of a little bobcat long after her paw prints have faded. As you stay with this story, you might gently consider, where in your own life is love asking you to hold something loosely, to protect its wildness, even if that means someday opening your hands? On Cedar's last regular day at the library, nothing looked particularly dramatic from the outside. The sky over Willow Creek had that soft, late fall haze, and the parking lot filled the way it always did. A teacher on her lunch break, a retiree with a tote bag, a paramedic just off shift. Inside, the clock ticked, the vents hummed, and pages turned. Only if you knew what you were looking at would you have noticed that every chair in the local history room was taken, and that people were not just reading, they were watching the highest shelf, where a young bobcat lay with her paws tucked neatly under her chest, eyes half closed, tail hanging over the edge like a loose comma. The wildlife rescue had been clear. Cedar was almost grown now. She needed more space than any library could give. More sky, more rock, more room to be a bobcat without constantly adjusting herself to human schedules. They had arranged a larger, more natural enclosure at their center, a stepping stone toward whatever came next. Sanctuary, or, if she proved ready, a carefully planned return to wilder ground. So this day was not a grand farewell. Just a quiet acknowledgement that a season was ending. Nora felt it most clearly when she unlocked the doors that morning. For months, she'd opened the building with a knot of vigilance in her chest that slowly softened as Cedar's breathing and the room's soft soundscape wrapped around each other. Today, as she walked past the reading room, she paused longer than usual. Cedar was already awake, ears flicking, watching her through the glass. There was no music, no speeches. Nora simply stepped inside, set a bowl of fresh water down and said, "Morning, Cedar," in the same tone you might use with an old friend who has seen you at your worst and stayed anyway. During Wild Neighbor Hour that afternoon, Nora read from a slim book about the bobcats of the Rockies, about how they move along creek beds, how they vanish into brush with 2 easy steps, how most people never know they've passed within a stone's throw of one. The room listened, not only to the words, but to the soft creaks of Cedar shifting on her shelf, to the subtle thump of her tail against the wall. When Nora reached a passage about how wild animals leave more than tracks behind, that they also change the people who notice them, her voice caught just enough that a few listeners glanced up. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. After the reading, there was no line for photos. The rescue educator simply thanked everyone for respecting Cedar's space and mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd be spending more time at the center now, preparing for life beyond these walls. You could feel the air change, just slightly. The ER nurse looked down at his hands. Mrs. Ramirez blinked a little too often, yarn gone still in her lap. The grad student, who had long ago slipped her headphones down around her neck, stared up at the bobcat kitten as if trying to memorize the exact curve of her spine against the shelf. On the day Cedar actually left, there were no patrons present. The rescue team came early, before opening. They moved with the kind of practiced calm that kept animals from panicking. Slow steps, steady hands, a carrier with blankets that smelled like the spaces Cedar already knew. Nora watched from the doorway, heart pounding. For a moment, Cedar hesitated, every inch the wild cat, deciding whether this new box was a trap or a path. Then she stepped in, drawn by familiarity, by the scent of the people who had been tending her all along. The door clicked shut with a sound that was somehow both gentle and final. When they carried her out, Nora walked behind, noticing the weight of the carrier, the sway of Cedar's body inside, the way the morning light spilled over the rescue truck parked at the curb. It struck her that the library's quiet, which had once felt like a way to freeze time, was now making room for things to move on. In the weeks that followed, the building felt both emptier and more alive. The high shelf in the reading room stood bare for a while, as if, in respect, people still came at the usual hours and caught themselves glancing up, expecting to see tufted ears or that crooked, smiling bobcat expression in the gap between books. When they didn't, they adjusted, slowly. Nora and the staff filled the gap with something different, a small framed photo of Cedar peeking through the shelves, and beneath it, a short note about the wildlife rescue that had cared for her, and about the wild bobcats still moving along the creeks and ridgelines beyond town. Wild Neighbor Hour continued, now with stories and short videos from the rescue center. Cedar, in a larger enclosure, climbing higher, muscles more defined, glimpses of other bobcat kittens passing through, red-tailed hawks being released, foxes trotting back into the brush. The library had become a place where people came not just for silence, but for connection. To each other, to the land beyond the parking lot, to animals whose lives looked nothing like their own and yet somehow reached the same tender places inside. Nora's relationship with sound changed for good. The clock still ticked. Doors still opened and closed. Someone still drops a book now and then. But when laughter rose in the room, she no longer felt her body brace for disaster. Her gaze, almost by habit, drifted to the high shelf. Even when it was empty, she could almost see a bobcat kitten stretched out there, reminding her that not every sharp noise is the beginning of an ending. Sometimes it's just another heartbeat in a living space. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the windows exactly the way it had on that first wild day, Nora stood in the center of the main room and listened. The soundscape was modest. Low conversation, a chuckle from the magazine corner, a printer humming, a chair leg scratching quietly against the floor. A layered hum of human life that no longer felt like too much. In the corner of her eye, she caught the small photo of her father on the Thomas Bennett Community Lecture Series poster, and right beside it, Cedar's picture. Two different kinds of teachers in the same building. One had loved telling stories about the past. One had walked in on soft feet and taught everyone in the room something about the present. If you've stayed with this story all the way here, maybe part of it has brushed up against your own life. Maybe you have a room that got too quiet after someone left. Maybe you carry a nervous system that startles at every sudden sound. Maybe there's a bobcat in your world, some wild-hearted person or experience that showed up uninvited, made you laugh when you didn't think you could, and then moved on, leaving you a little different than before. If you can, take a moment after this video ends to sit with that. Notice the sounds around you. Ask yourself which ones you've been treating as threats that might actually be signs that life is still here, moving, breathing, offering small, unexpected comedy shows in the middle of serious days. And if stories like Cedar's help you feel more connected to nature, to animals, to your own heart, you're welcome to stay with us. Gently tap as if this bobcat kitten's time in a quiet library meant something to you. And subscribe if you'd like to hear more calm, healing stories about wild neighbors and the humans who cross their paths. If you feel moved to go one step further, you can use the Super Thanks button or support a trusted local wildlife rescue near you. It's one of the simplest ways to help rescue, care for, and heal wild animals like bobcats who wander close to our human worlds and need a soft place to land before they return to the lives they were meant to live.